This is one of my favorite subjects. I want to start off by talking. I'm going to try to go from composition, like, okay, how do we get the Old Testament? Books in terms of them being composed or written, and they do a little bit with the editorial process, some of the things that went into that, and then talk about how the things that were produced, the books that were produced, were recognized again as canonical or as inspired or given sacred status. Just a little bit on that, and then we'll talk about transmission, which a lot of people, when you say, let's talk about how we got the Old Testament, it's what the scribes do. What about all these manuscripts and whatnot? So we'll hit that as well, and that's a pretty involved, but I think again really interesting subject that once we get to that point, be we'll be able to touch at least a little bit on conspiracy land. So there is some of this with the Old Testament. But then, once the text was transmitted by hand, you do reach a certain point where it begins to be published, things like the printing press, and all the way up to the modern day, actual sort of official published editions of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And we'll end by mentioning that, hey, even though we've got a lot of this stuff published, there are actually three, in the case of Old Testament, three ongoing Old Testament text projects as we speak. So you might wonder, well, isn't the job done? Don't we have the Hebrew Bible? The answer is yeah, we do. But as we'll learn when we get especially into manuscript transmission, there are different approaches that people take. Scholars have taken with regard to producing a particular edition of the Hebrew Bible, and there are naturally disagreements on approaches and sort of methods, and so that's what a lot of the current work is doing, to people just taking different approaches on how to produce a useful Hebrew Bible for today. But let's just jump in, kind of at the beginning, with composition and editorial activity. And chronologically, again, this is something, again, if you take a conservative, view of Mosaic authorship, whether that means, Moses lived and wrote something, or Moses wrote the whole Torah, right away you get into a chronological issue. Is that roughly 1400 BC? That would be the early date. The early date of the Exodus would be 1446. So authorship of what we think of as the Torah, the initial, books, at least in that reconstruction, would be around 1400. But if you take the late date, then it's around 1200. So just going with the early date, the books of the Hebrew Bible, again, and the Hebrew Bible is essentially like a library. It's composed of many books. That began, again, in the lifetime of Moses. We're talking 1400 or 1200 BC, and it continues all the way into the 2nd century BC. Now, that is especially true if, again, you assign late authorship to a book like Daniel. A lot of people don't. Daniel, a big controversy. Was it written in the 6th century BC, or was it written in the 2nd century BC, whatnot? But I'm giving a 2nd century BC date also because even if Daniel was written in the 6th century and you have other books that are written maybe, in the 500s and the 400s, books like, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, those sorts of things, you're still, running right into around 400 BC for the original compositions. But then you have editorial activity that begins in the exile and moves on, for a few centuries. That, again, to the best, estimates of scholars, this was a process that went on for a couple centuries. And so, 3rd century going down to the 2nd century BC is typically when scholars of all varieties, whether they're confessional or not, they would sort of say, well, the whole thing was kind of wrapped up by this point, at least as far as the Old Testament goes. So you got a good 1,000 years. Let's see, 1400 to 200 BC. That's 1200. But even at the late date, you still got 1,000 years course of time for the creation of the books of the Hebrew Bible. Now, what are they doing? Well, when we talk about composition, some books would have been composed in the old Hebrew script. We're going to talk about scripts a little bit, both now and a little bit later. But folks need to realize that when you look at Hebrew today, you see a picture of the Hebrew Bible, or you actually have a Hebrew Bible, or you see it online or whatever, the style of letters, the script that's used, was not the original Hebrew script. The original Hebrew script looked quite a bit different. If you know anything about the history of the alphabet, again, you know where this comes from. The Semitic alphabet, has Egyptian origins, and then it moves into different parts of Syria, Palestine, where Semitic peoples are using this particular alphabet. It often gets assigned, to the Phoenicians. Well, the Phoenicians weren't the ones who invented the alphabet, but the style that they came up with was widely used again throughout the ancient world, including Israel, including the biblical lands. So you do have some books written in the old Hebrew script. The block script, that's the script that we're accustomed now, the way Hebrew looks to our eye now. That was something that came about during the exile. So during the exile, you might have a book written in that script and not the old one. But eventually, during and after the exile, again, over the course of a few centuries, you're going to have books that may have been written in the old Hebrew script. They have to be updated, they have to be reproduced in the new script. So that's part of composing and editing. You also have instances where you're taking oral tradition and you're codifying it, you're putting it into writing. And if you take a non-Mosaic view of at least parts of the Torah, you might say something like, well, Israel's early history, the patriarchs, that was something that was put into oral, from oral tradition into writing during the exile. Others would say, well, Moses could have done that. He doesn't have to invent that stuff. He would have, known the oral history of his people, and so he did it. But regardless, some books, when they're written, are not just written from scratch, so to speak. They're actually reproductions. They're written, codification of oral tradition. So that's part of how books were composed. Sometimes you get a book that's quote unquote complete, and then it gets added to. Now, our last episode, we talked about Moses and the serpent in the wilderness, and I said, my preference is to see Genesis 1 through 11 as written later than Moses during the exile and then added to the Torah, sort of a primeval history added prior to the history of the people of Israel, which begins with Abraham and whatnot. And so, again, if either that's the case or some other instance, we're going to talk about a few of these instances, then you have books that were quote unquote complete, but then they get added to or they get changed, they get edited so that something else can be fit in there. That happens, in the creation of a biblical book. When I talk about editing, some of that I've already talked about, is part of the picture. Well, we got something to add here, so we need to change some wording here and there so the addition makes sense, and because we've added something, we might need to change a word or two down the road a little bit, again, so that it all makes sense. You have kind of traditional editing like that, and we'll look at some examples. But you also have the kind of editorial activity that only people who are either reading the text in Hebrew or who know Semitic languages would recognize. And that is, Hebrew is like any other language. It evolves over time. Its vocabulary changes. That's the most obvious change that most people know about a language. Even over the course of our lifetime, English has changed. Every year they give awards to new words invented that get added to the dictionary. Which one is the best one or the most popular one? Like words like internet, didn't exist when I was in high school. World Wide Web, was a term that just didn't exist. All sorts of things. Smartphone didn't exist when I was in high school. So you have vocabulary changes, and they're the easiest ones to understand. But you also have grammatical changes. And Hebrew, because Hebrew is a very old language, the grammar used in earliest Hebrew is not quite the same as we find in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so sometimes in the Hebrew Bible, you'll be reading along and you will see what scholars call an archaic form. That there's an old form, an old grammatical form in the text that never got changed. And sometimes that helps you date a text, sometimes it doesn't, but it happens. It's evidence that either the editor, some editor who was updating it to go from old Hebrew language whenever this book was originally written, now we're updating it into biblical Hebrew prose, quote unquote, classical Hebrew, that they either missed that or they let it go for some specific reason. And then scholars like to try to figure out, why is it still here and that sort of thing. But you get that. One of the more prominent examples of this would be vowels. Now, Hebrew originally had no vowels. It doesn't get dots and dashes like we are used to seeing today for Hebrew vowels. That doesn't happen until the Middle Ages. But prior to that, Hebrew used certain consonants to do double duty as vowels. And that practice of using certain consonants to also function as vowels varied over time. It was more common in earliest Hebrew as opposed to the Hebrew Bible we have today, because once the dot and dash vowel system was invented, the scribes didn't see a use for making consonants do double duty. That's why a biblical Hebrew passage will have different letters, different spelling than like a Dead Sea Scroll. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about all these things, but I'm just giving you kind of an overview. The things that you have to think about are the things that are happening even when you're trying to just write the text out, when you're trying to produce a book to be copied and transmitted. All of these things are happening. Yes, prophets, prophetic, voices, in the believing community, people called by God sit down and write stuff. They do that. But what they write will get refashioned. It will get updated either by script or by grammar, by vocabulary. All of these things happen over the course of time as scribes take what exists and then modify it according to what people are reading or are able to read at their particular time. Over the span of 1,000 or 1,200 years, this just happens. In other words, the text of the Hebrew Bible doesn't just drop from heaven. It is the product of human beings, again, that God chooses, God calls. And to produce a readable thing by the end of that 1,000-year period, you've had all sorts of things happen to it. You've had all sorts of hands touch it. Again, scribes, people who know what they're doing, and they produce what we call in scholarship as the quote, the final form of the text. And the final form of biblical books, again, you can pretty much say, okay, 300, 200 BC. Hebrew Bible is in its final form around that time. That's a safe number. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the specifics here when it comes to, content editing. Again, just giving you some examples of how things in the text have to be changed. And I'm not going to go into grammatical forms and this is what the first common singular used to look like, and that just doesn't translate well to podcasts, and it also requires a certain knowledge of Semitic morphology. I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to stick to more substantive examples of how the Hebrew Bible itself informs us that it did have editorial hands in it. Example, just a couple from content editing. Ezekiel 1. I've used this example in other discussions before. It might be familiar to listeners, but if you open your Bible and you go to Ezekiel 1, the first 3 verses, I'm going to read it to you, and just ask yourself if anything sounds unusual here. So here we go. Ezekiel 1, verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kivar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kivar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Okay, that's Ezekiel 1 through 3. What's odd about it? What's odd is that in 3 verses you have a change from the first person, I was among the exiles, I saw visions of God, to the third person, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, that guy over there. The hand of the Lord was upon him. It doesn't say the word of the Lord came to me. It doesn't say the hand of the Lord was upon me after the first person. It doesn't do that. It changes from first person to third person, just in the span of 3 verses. And you actually have the Kivar Canal mentioned twice, once with the first person references and once with the third person references. This is just point blank evidence that someone did editorial work. So we could have had a text that Ezekiel himself wrote in the first person, and a scribe comes along, maybe they collected a lot of Ezekiel's sermons or whatnot, and they want to fashion them into a readable book. And so, okay, we'll leave the first person in here. Ezekiel gets to introduce his own book. But now, we have to start filling in some gaps here to tell a story about Ezekiel. Okay, and so it switches to third person. So someone again, is working with the text with resources, whether they be sermons written down by somebody, a stenographer or a scribe or what. I mean, Jeremiah had Baruch the scribe. There was a school of the prophets, where people were trained to do what prophets do, which was preach. So somebody's writing stuff down, and then somebody has to fashion it into a book. And this is it's a very easy example to see how this comes about, how this happens, and how it's reflected in the text. Here's another one. You'll read in the Psalms, at Psalm 72, verse 20, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. Really? Because you'll find Psalms after Psalm 72 that are Psalms, prayers of David. Oh, there's an error in Psalm 72:20, because there are Psalms of David that come afterwards. Oh, this is an error. No, what it tells you, again, if you look at the Psalms, it's actually composed of 5 separate books. The book of Psalms is actually 5 distinct books, and they were collected over time. And so at some point, the collection ended at Psalm 72:20, and a scribe, an editor, said, hey, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. This is what we got. Well, maybe somebody living 100 years after him said, hey, there's more of these. David wrote more of them, and we need to put them in there too. And so they'd get added to the end. Okay, that's just the way it is. And they don't bother, again, to correct the language of 72:20. It just stays in there. Again, it's proof of, again, editorial activity, or in this case, it's proof of more material being brought into a book. And then this kind of language, again, is just left untouched, for whatever reason. Scribes do what they do. They have reasons for not doing or doing something because they're people, right? We just are dealing with the product of their decisions. We also have in Psalms changes in the divine name, or at least unusual patterns. For instance, in the Psalms, Psalm 1 to Psalm 41, so you got 40 Psalms there, and then Psalms 90 through 106 use the term Yahweh, the divine name, YHWH, almost exclusively, almost 100% of the time. But in between those two groups, remember I just said Psalm 140 or 1 to 41, and then Psalms 90 to 106. In between that, Psalms 73 to 83, you almost never see YHWH. You see Elohim instead. Well, why is that? And then afterwards, from Psalm 84 through Psalm 89, you get both, and then you're going to have both, scattered, along the way as you keep going in the book of Psalms. Why these patterns? Why do you have clusterings of Yahweh, in some sections to almost almost an exclusive way, and then in another section it's completely flipped around. You never use Yahweh; you only use Elohim. The scholars refer to these sections, the ones that use Elohim, as the Elohistic Psalter. Again, that it was put together by a different group or a different scribe or scribes than the ones who collected and edited the other group. And they just had a preference for what are we going to use? We're going to use the divine name. We're going to use Elohim. And we're just left to look at and observe the product of their decisions. But these patterns are there. They're not contrived. They're just there. There's also duplicate Psalms. Why does Psalm 53, is that the same as Psalm 14? Why is, Psalm 70 the same as Psalm 40, or, sections of that? Psalm 108, similar to sections in Psalm 57. I mean, almost word for word. Why is that? Okay, well, nobody really knows, but for some reason, you have duplication going on as well in the Psalms. Someone had to either decide to produce the duplication or just leave it in and not take it out. These are just, again, editorial decisions. Another example, and this is a common one, and I'm going to mention an article here and read from it because I think it's a good overview of this issue. Plus, I know the author, and he's a good guy. Mike Grisanti, who teaches at Masters Seminary, wrote an article a number of years ago called Inspiration, Inerrancy, and the Old Testament Canon, subtitle, The Place of Textual Updating in an Inerrant View of Scripture. Now, whether you like the word inerrancy or not isn't the issue here. I mean, in my view, you don't even have to use it to understand this article and to get a lot of benefit out of the article. But what Grisanti does in the article is show examples of how the biblical text was updated. And then he knows that, you could point this out to people point out the content of his article to people, and they might be troubled. Oh, well, how can I believe the Bible's a trustworthy source if these things were changed? They wouldn't have been changed unless they were errors. So he tries to correct some of the frankly poor thinking that goes into that. Hence the title of his article. But let me just read from Grisanti and give you a few examples. Again, this is all the process of composition, all the process of, quote, achieving the final form of the text. That's what we're talking about. How do we get our Old Testament? Well, first you have to have the final form of all the books, and then they're put together in this thing we call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So this is where we're starting. How do we get the final forms of the books? What's going on? What's happening to them? What's the process? Again, just giving you little glimpses of the process. So Grisanti says, the place name Dan often appears in the historical books as a reference to the northernmost point of the Promised Land. And he gives a few references, Judges 18:29, 21, 20 verse 1, so on and so forth, and is part of the common geographical expression from Dan to Beersheba, like in 1 Samuel 3:20. It is customarily identified with Tel el-Qadi, that's Qadi. This ancient city was known as Laish in the Egyptian execration texts and the Mari text. Let me just stop there. Execration texts it was kind of a form of sympathetic magic where Egyptians would, priests or whatnot, they would write names of either people or places, cities, on like pieces of pottery, their enemies, and then they would smash the bowl and stomp on it and grind it to a powder. Like that's going to make them go away now. This is part of defeating my enemies. So execration texts were this kind of stuff written on, again, pieces of pottery, or even, in theory, you could have it written on anything and just destroyed. But a lot of the execration texts we know come from discoveries of the pottery. You put them back together, and that's what you got. So Grisanti mentions, well, this place that everybody, pretty much identifies with Dan used to be known as Laish in the Egyptian execration text. A number of them, predate the Mosaic era. The Mari texts certainly do. And Grisanti continues, the city of Dan received its name in the settlement period when the Danite tribe migrated north and conquered the city of Laish. That's in Genesis 14:14. You will specifically, again, read that reference. Okay. Now, here's the kicker. Consequently, it appears that this place did not receive the name Dan until after the Mosaic period. If you look at Judges 18:29, it says this. This is after the tribe of Dan migrates from the south to the north. It says, and they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. It actually says that in the Bible. So when you have Dan used of this spot, this location, prior to this period, somebody, after the name change occurred, had to update the text. This is, again, what Grisanti is pointing out. He continues, Genesis 14:14 mentions Dan as the ending point of the first phase of Abram's pursuit of Lot's captors. From Dan, Abraham and his men divided into two groups and pursued the enemy as far as the region to the north of Damascus. We may assume that Moses originally wrote Laish, which was later changed to Dan when the place name was actually changed. The geographical parameter, another kind of proof of this, the geographical parameter of Gilead, this is a quote from Deuteronomy 34:1, Gilead as far as Dan in Deuteronomy 34:1, and the placement of the blessing for the tribe of Dan, Deuteronomy 33:22, after the blessings promised to Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, and before the blessings promised to Asher, all of those were northern tribes, suggests a similar updating. Here's the point. So if Moses is supposed to be writing Deuteronomy, Moses is using, at least when we look at our Bible, you have references in Deuteronomy, supposedly again from the hand of Moses, using the term Dan. But that place only became Dan in the period of the Judges, which is well after Moses. Again, because of what it says in Judges 18:29. It was changed in the period of the Judges from Dan, or from Laish to Dan. So it was changed after Moses was long dead. So Moses would not have used the word Dan, he would have used the word Laish because that was the name of the place when he was living. So in our Hebrew Bible, where it says Dan everywhere, instead of Laish, for what Moses was supposed to have written, either Moses didn't write it or somebody had to update the place names. Now, Grisanti's view of Deuteronomy is that Moses wrote it, and that someone, again, in this case, a place name, had to go through the text and change the name of these locations so that people who were reading it in the period of Judges and beyond would know what the text is even talking about. Okay, because if they kept using Laish, if they kept the text as it was, no one living in the period of Judges or later is going to know where that place is, because there is no Laish anymore. It had been renamed. So scribes, this is the kind of thing they do. They will work through a text and they will update place names. Sometimes they will do it with personal names, but typically this happens with place names so that their readers know where these things happen, what the text is even talking about. You have phrases like "unto this day" in the Hebrew Bible. This is also from Grisanti. The statement that Bashan was called Havoth Yair unto this day in honor of Yair, the son of Manasseh, who was influential in the conquest of that region, and that information comes from Deuteronomy 3:14. That statement would make little sense in the time of Moses when that region was first taken over by Israel. This phrase suggests the passage of some time. Again, so in Moses' day, it would have been called one thing, and after Moses' day, it would have been called another. So when you see the more recent name in a Mosaic text, and you know it shouldn't have been there because it only got changed after Moses died, somebody else had to do that. The text gets edited. And that's all we're talking about. So when it comes to achieving the final form of the text, the books of the Hebrew Bible go through a considerable process. Again, there's updating of the script. We have to basically rewrite everything that had been written in the old Hebrew lettering script, because now for the people alive here in the exile, the Jewish community right here, nobody can read that. So we need to use the new script, the block script that we are familiar with, but that was adopted during the exile because that's what people in Babylon were using for Aramaic, which was the language of commerce, the language of the day. Everybody knew Aramaic, and this is the way Aramaic was written. So the Hebrew scribes adopted the script, and they converted the text of the Hebrew Bible into that script so that people living during that time, and of course beyond, would be able to read their Bible. So that just happens. Grammatical changes happen. Vocabulary changes happen. Place name changes happen. Arrangement of material gets edited. New material gets added. All of these things just happen. They are part of the process of producing the final form of the Hebrew Bible. Each book has undergone to some degree this kind of process. And again, we have to get away from this notion that when we look at a Hebrew text, and in some cases people even think this way with the English Bible, it just wasn't dictated. It just didn't drop from heaven. That is not the way you got it. It just isn't, by virtue of its own testimony. The features in the text, this has nothing to do with, oh, do you believe there's a God or not? Do you believe in inspiration or not? Do you believe science or not? It has nothing to do with any of that talk. This has to do with what you actually find in the text that has to be accounted for. And, theologically, this is not a troublesome thing. Why? Because you know what it means? It means that God used people to produce the Bible. What a novel thought. Hey, newsflash, that's what the Bible actually says. Okay, God used people to produce it. And people use, drum roll please, human processes. Okay, they're not like supernaturally gifted. They don't become mutants. They don't go into trances. They write and they edit, and frankly, they do a good job. I mean, the Bible in terms of literary quality is a wondrous thing. Even if no one assigns any theological or religious validity to it, it has long been recognized as a thing of wonder just in terms of the literary output. They knew what they were doing.